What if I told you that every single conflict you've ever lost, every argument that left you speechless, every opportunity that slipped through your fingers, every battle where you were left humiliated and diminished, was not lost in the moment it happened? It was lost long before. It was lost in the silence before the storm, in the preparation you didn't do, in the enemy you didn't study, in the terrain you didn't map, in the version of yourself you failed to sharpen. Pay close attention to what comes next, because this is not a motivational speech. This is not a feel-good message designed to make you clap and forget. What you are about to hear is the cold, calculated doctrine of one of history's most feared strategists, a man who understood power so deeply that kings trembled at his words, a man who saw through the illusions of conflict and reduced war to its most naked, brutal truth. That man was Niccolò Machiavelli, and his doctrine was simple, devastating, irrefutable. Every war is won before it starts. Read that again. Let it sit. Let it sink past the surface of your thinking, past the comfortable assumptions you carry about strength and conflict and victory. Because if you truly internalize what that sentence means, not intellectually, not as a quote you share on social media, but in your bones, in your instincts, in the way you move through the world, then nothing will ever defeat you in the same way again. But before we get there, we need to talk about you. We need to talk about the version of you that keeps losing. You know that version. You've met him. You've been him. Maybe you are him right now, reading this, watching this, feeling that familiar weight of someone who senses that something is fundamentally wrong with the way they engage with the world, with conflict, with competition, with the invisible wars that are fought every single day in offices, relationships, social circles, and the silence between words. That version of you reacts. He doesn't prepare. He shows up to battles that have already been decided, swinging blindly, emotional, unguarded. And then he wonders why he keeps bleeding. That version of you thinks the fight begins when the first blow lands. Machiavelli knew otherwise. Let's talk about the most dangerous misunderstanding most people carry about conflict. They believe, deeply, almost religiously, that strength is demonstrated in the fight itself. That the person who hits harder wins. That the person who argues louder wins. That the person who endures more pain wins. They have been trained by a culture of spectacle to worship the performance of conflict, to celebrate the drama of battle, to mistake suffering for virtue and reaction for power. This is the trap. This is the beautiful, seductive, devastating trap that keeps ordinary people ordinary. Because the truly powerful, the ones Machiavelli wrote about, the ones history remembers, the ones whose enemies never quite understood how they kept losing, those people understood something different. They understood that by the time a conflict becomes visible, the outcome has already been determined. By the time the argument erupts in the meeting room, one person has already won. By the time the negotiation begins, one side has already surrendered. By the time the confrontation becomes unavoidable, one player has already moved into position so perfectly, so silently, so strategically, that the other is simply walking into a conclusion that was written long ago. This is what Machiavelli meant. This is what history has tried to teach us over and over, in every court and every battlefield and every boardroom and every bedroom, and what we keep refusing to learn because we are too intoxicated by the idea of visible strength. Invisible strength. That is the doctrine. Let me tell you about the world Machiavelli inhabited, because you need to understand the environment that forged these ideas. Florence in the late 15th century was not a place of polite disagreement. It was a city-state, drowning in treachery, where alliances formed and dissolved like morning fog, where the man who smiled at you over dinner might be engineering your destruction before sunrise. Where power was not given, it was seized, maintained through relentless calculation, and lost the moment you stopped thinking 3 moves ahead. In this world, Machiavelli watched. He studied. He served as a diplomat and a military strategist, traveling to the courts of Europe. sitting across from popes and kings and warlords, observing with that cold, precise intelligence that made him simultaneously admired and feared. And what he observed, over and over, was this. The people who won were not always the strongest. They were not always the most righteous, the most popular, the most obviously dangerous. They were the most prepared. They were the ones who had already fought the war in their minds, mapped every possible outcome, accounted for every variable, and arrived at the visible conflict already holding the conclusion in their hands like a weapon they had forged in private, in silence, in the long hours before anyone else was paying attention. Wars begin when you will, Machiavelli wrote, but they do not end when you please. Think about that. Wars begin when you will. You choose the moment. You choose the terrain. You choose the conditions. And you only have the power to make those choices if you have done the invisible work, the preparation, the intelligence gathering, the self-fortification, long before the war declares itself. But here is what most people do instead. They wait. They react. They allow the enemy, whether that enemy is a rival, a circumstance, an adversary, a failing in themselves, to choose the terrain, to choose the moment, to dictate the conditions, and then they fight bravely, desperately, sometimes heroically, and they lose, because bravery without strategy is just a beautiful way to bleed. You have probably experienced this. Not on a battlefield, most of us never will, but in the quiet wars of daily life. The conversation where someone blindsided you with information you didn't have. The opportunity you missed because you hadn't positioned yourself in advance. The relationship that deteriorated because you didn't see the warning signs until the damage was irreversible. The negotiation where you walked in unprepared and walked out diminished. The moment where someone played a card you didn't know they were holding, and you stood there exposed, scrambling, already defeated. Those losses were not random. They were not bad luck. They were the predictable outcome of an approach to conflict that Machiavelli would have recognized immediately and would have diagnosed with one word: unpreparedness. And unpreparedness is not a single failure. It is a posture. It is an orientation toward life that says, I will deal with things when they arrive. It is reactive. It is passive. It is, in the deepest sense, powerless, because it hands the initiative to whoever or whatever comes your way and simply hopes that the collision goes in your favor. The powerful don't hope, they engineer. Now, let's be precise about something, because this is where many people begin to misunderstand Machiavelli. They hear strategy, and they think manipulation. They hear preparation, and they think paranoia. They hear winning before the war starts, and they imagine some elaborate scheme of deception, some spiderweb of lies and traps, the kind of thing they associate with villains in films, with cold, calculating sociopaths who treat other people as chess pieces. That is a cartoon version of what Machiavelli actually taught. Yes, Machiavelli was unflinching about the realities of power. He did not dress up hard truths in comfortable language. He did not pretend that the world operated according to the principles it claimed to hold sacred. He wrote about power as it actually functions, not as idealists wished it would. And that honesty made people uncomfortable, made rulers nervous, made the church brand his name as synonymous with the devil himself. But at the core of his philosophy was something much more profound than manipulation. It was mastery. The mastery of self, the mastery of environment, the mastery of timing, the understanding that the person who knows themselves completely, who has mapped their own weaknesses, fortified their own vulnerabilities, who is not surprised by their own reactions under pressure. That person carries a structural advantage into every conflict they ever face. Because most people do not know themselves. Not really. They know the version of themselves that exists in comfort, in safety, in predictability. They do not know what they become under pressure. They have not tested their own composure. have not stood in the fire long enough to understand where they bend. And so, when the battle comes, and it always comes, they encounter not only the enemy in front of them, but the enemy within them. The panic, the ego, the emotional flooding, the desperate need to be right, to be seen, to be validated in the middle of a fight. That is the real reason most people lose, not because their opponent was stronger, but because they were at war with themselves at the exact moment they needed to be at war with their opponent. Machiavelli watched this happen constantly. He saw generals lose battles not to superior forces, but to their own pride. He saw princes lose thrones not to smarter rivals, but to their own need for approval. He saw men of genuine talent consistently outmaneuvered by men of lesser ability simply because those lesser men had done the interior work, had killed the part of themselves that could be rattled, had practiced stillness until it became instinct, had learned to wait while others rushed. This is the first principle, and it is the foundation on which everything else is built. Before you can win the external war, you must win the internal one. Before you can outmaneuver an opponent, you must have already outmaneuvered the version of yourself that reacts impulsively, that gets emotional, that can be provoked, flattered, frightened, or destabilized by the unexpected. This is not easy. Let's not pretend it is. This is the work that most people avoid, the deep, uncomfortable, unglamorous labor of sitting with your own weaknesses, not to wallow in them, not to punish yourself for them, but to look at them with the same cold clarity that Machiavelli would have looked at an enemy's formation on a battlefield and ask, where is the vulnerability? Where is the gap? What would it take to close it? Because every weakness you leave unexamined is a weapon your opponent can use against you. Every insecurity you haven't addressed is a lever someone can pull. Every emotional trigger you haven't identified and controlled is a remote control in someone else's hands. The prepared warrior has no remote controls. Or rather, he has found them all himself, has dismantled them, has replaced them with something that looks like a remote control from the outside, but is actually a trap. He allows his enemies to think they can provoke him, and then he watches them exhaust themselves trying, while he remains still, composed, unreadable, calculating. This is not coldness. This is not sociopathy. This is mastery. Think about the people in your life who seem untouchable. The ones who never seem rattled, who never take the bait, who somehow always seem to be operating from a position of quiet confidence regardless of the circumstances. What you're observing in those people is not luck. It is not a personality type they were born with. It is the result of invisible work. Preparation, self-study, the daily practice of stillness under pressure. They are winning their wars before they start. Every morning, every interaction, every decision about where to place their attention, what to respond to, what to ignore, when to speak, when to be silent, when to advance, when to retreat. All of it strategic, all of it deliberate. All of it the result of preparation that most people never do, because most people don't believe it's necessary until they're already in the fire. By then, it's too late. Now, and pay close attention here, this doctrine applies not just to conflict in the traditional sense, not just to arguments and confrontations and competitions. It applies to opportunity. Because opportunity, Machiavelli understood, is a form of battle. The moment an opportunity presents itself, there is a race, sometimes visible, sometimes invisible, between those who are prepared to seize it and those who are not. And that race, in most cases, is already over by the time the opportunity becomes apparent. The prepared person recognizes the opportunity before it announces itself. They have been building toward it, positioning themselves in its path, making themselves ready to act the moment the window opens. So when the window opens, they move instantly, not frantically, but decisively, and to everyone watching, it looks like luck. It is not luck. It is preparation meeting its moment. Fortune is a woman, Machiavelli wrote in The Prince, in one of his most infamous passages. And it is necessary, if you wish to master her, to conquer her by force. People have argued endlessly about the imagery in that passage. But what he meant, stripped of its Renaissance language, is this: fortune, opportunity, fate. These things do not wait politely for you to be ready. They move. They shift. They favor those who are aggressive in their preparation, decisive in their action, and willing to seize the moment with both hands rather than watching it pass while they debate whether they are ready. Are you seizing your moments? Or are you watching them pass, telling yourself that the next one will come, that you'll be better prepared then, that now isn't quite the right time? If you've answered honestly, you know whether you're operating from strength or from drift. And if you're operating from drift, if you're moving through life reactively, waiting to see what comes, rather than engineering what comes, then the rest of this video is not just information, it is a reckoning, because we're not going to stop at philosophy. We're not going to spend an hour quoting Machiavelli and then send you back to your life unchanged. The purpose of this video is transformation, not the comfortable, gradual kind that happens quietly over years, but the sharp, specific, immediate kind that happens when you finally understand something so clearly that you cannot unknow it. You are about to understand, with a precision you have never had before, exactly what it means to win before the war starts, what it looks like in practice, how it changes the way you prepare, the way you think, the way you move, the way you communicate, the way you position yourself in every situation that matters, and most importantly, how you begin, starting now, to become the kind of person who never shows up to a battle unprepared again. Stay with me, because what's coming next will change the way you see every conflict you've ever been a part of, and every one you're about to face. The doctrine goes deeper than you think, and you're only at the beginning. Machiavelli didn't just observe the wars of his time, he dissected them. He sat in the ruins of each defeat and asked the question that no one else was willing to ask. Not why did this army lose, but when did this army lose? And again, the answer pointed not to the battlefield, not to the day of reckoning, but to the weeks and months before, to the decisions not made, to the intelligence not gathered, to the alliances not formed, to the weaknesses not addressed, to the enemies not studied, to the preparation that didn't happen. He watched the city of Florence itself fall into crisis after crisis, not because it lacked talented people, not because it lacked resources, not because its enemies were invincible, but because its leaders consistently failed to prepare for what was coming. They were reactive. They addressed problems after they became catastrophes. They formed alliances after they needed them. They strengthened walls after the enemy was already inside. Sound familiar? It should. Because we do this every single day, in every domain of our lives. We address health problems after they become emergencies. We repair relationships after they've fractured. We develop skills after we've already lost the opportunity that required them. We study the competition after we've already been outcompeted. We fight our wars after we've already lost them. And here is what Machiavelli would say to you, directly, without the softening that modern culture has trained you to demand. That is not a character flaw. It is not a moral failing. It is a strategic error. A systematic, correctable, inexcusable strategic error. And the only path out of it is not self-compassion or positive thinking or the belief that things will work out. The path out of it is ruthless, disciplined, ongoing preparation. You must become the person who, when crisis comes, because it always comes, has already lived through it in their mind, has already mapped the terrain, has already identified the likely threats and the likely opportunities, and has positioned themselves accordingly. This is the warrior's posture, not aggressive, not paranoid, not fearful, but aware, calibrated, perpetually scanning the horizon, not with anxiety, but with the calm intelligence of someone who knows that the future is not a mystery to be feared, but a territory to be mapped. You are going to learn how to map it. But first, you need to understand why this is so difficult. Why preparation, a concept so simple and so obviously correct, is something that the vast majority of people consistently fail to practice. The answer is more interesting than you might expect. It's not laziness, not exactly. It's something Machiavelli would have called a failure of imagination. The inability to make future threats feel as real and urgent as present comfort. The human mind is wired for the immediate. It responds powerfully to threats that are visible, present, physical, and it consistently underweights threats that are distant, abstract, or merely possible. This is why we procrastinate. This is why we fail to prepare. Not because we are stupid or weak, but because our brains are running ancient software that was designed for a world where the only threats that mattered were the ones standing right in front of you. In Machiavelli's world, and in yours, the most dangerous threats are never the ones standing right in front of you. They are the ones approaching from the direction you aren't watching. They are the ones that have been in development for months while you were focused elsewhere. They are the ones that will arrive looking like opportunity, or like nothing at all, and only reveal themselves as threats after they've already done their damage. The prepared mind watches every direction simultaneously, not frantically, not anxiously, but with a cultivated, almost detached awareness. The awareness of someone who has decided that they will not be surprised, ever, by anything. That decision, the decision to never be surprised, is perhaps the single most powerful thing you can commit to, because it changes everything downstream. It changes how you gather information. It changes how you listen in conversations, not just for what people say, but for what they don't say, what they avoid, what they emphasize, what they reveal in the space between their words. It changes how you read environments, rooms, dynamics, power structures, seeing not just what is visible but what is implied. It changes how you manage your own communication, understanding that what you reveal is as strategic as what you conceal. The person who has decided never to be surprised is always, quietly, invisibly, gathering. Always processing, always mapping, always 3 steps ahead of the moment they're in. This is the mind Machiavelli was describing, not monstrous, not manipulative for the sake of manipulation, but relentlessly, systematically, calmly prepared. And this is the mind you're going to build. Because the war is coming. It's always coming. The question is not whether you'll face it. The question is whether you'll meet it as someone who has already won, or as someone who is only now realizing they should have prepared. Continue watching, because in the next block, we're going to go deep into the specific architecture of this preparation. The 5 pillars that Machiavelli identified as the foundations of pre-victory, and how each one applies to the battles you're fighting right now. The doctrine is older than you, and it's more powerful than anything you've been taught. You're just beginning to understand it. There is a particular kind of man that Machiavelli admired above all others. Not the strongest, not the most fearless, not the most brilliant in the traditional sense. The man Machiavelli admired was the one who never needed to fight at full force, because he had arranged things so thoroughly in advance that the fight, when it finally arrived, was already a formality. A closing ceremony for a war already decided. A ritual declaration of what the prepared had already known for weeks. This man moved differently. He spoke differently. There was a quality in his presence that people couldn't quite name. A stillness, a weight, a sense of someone who was never caught off guard, never scrambling, never desperate. People in his orbit felt it instinctively, even when they didn't understand it. And they responded to it in the way that human beings always respond to true preparation masquerading as natural authority. They followed, they yielded, they got out of the way. What was this quality? It was simple. This man had done the work that others hadn't. He had sat in the silence before the storm and mapped everything that could go wrong and everything that could go right. He had studied his enemies with the patience of a predator, not with hatred, not with fear, but with the cold, comprehensive attention of someone who understands that knowledge is the sharpest weapon in any arsenal. He had fortified himself from the inside, eliminated the weaknesses that could be exploited, the emotions that could be triggered, the blind spots that could be ambushed. He had, in every meaningful sense, already won. And now let's get surgical. Because understanding this principle conceptually is one thing. Building it into your architecture, into the way you actually operate day by day, decision by decision, that requires something more specific. It requires the 5 pillars. Machiavelli never called them that, of course. He wrote in the language of princes and armies. But when you extract the structural logic from his work, from the prince, from the discourses, from his art of war, from the letters and dispatches he sent to the Florentine Republic, 5 foundational disciplines emerge again and again as the building blocks of the man who wins before the war starts. These are not tactics. They are not tricks. They are disciplines, practices that, when cultivated consistently, transform the way you exist in relation to conflict, competition, and power. The first pillar, intelligence. Not intelligence in the sense of raw intellectual ability, though that matters too. Intelligence in the Machiavellian sense is information. Systematic, relentless, comprehensive information about the terrain you're operating in, the people you're dealing with, and the forces that are shaping the environment around you. Machiavelli was explicit about this. A prince, by which he meant any person in a position of power, any person whose decisions matter, any person engaged in consequential competition. A prince who does not have intelligence about his enemies is already half defeated, because he is navigating by assumption while they are navigating by fact. He is guessing while they are knowing. And in any conflict between a guesser and a knower, the knower wins. Think about the battles you've lost in your own life. How many of them were lost because you walked in without the information you needed? The negotiation where you didn't know what the other party actually wanted, what their constraints were, what they were afraid of, what would make them say yes. The confrontation where you didn't understand what the other person was actually reacting to beneath the surface. The competition where you didn't know your competitor's strengths well enough to position yourself differently. These were information failures, and they were preventable. The intelligence discipline looks like this in practice. Before any significant interaction, any high-stakes conversation, any competitive situation, you gather, you research, you ask questions before the moment arrives. You study the people involved, not to manipulate them, but to understand them. What do they value? What do they fear? What is their history in situations like this? What is their default behavior under pressure? What are the stories they tell about themselves? Because people are remarkably consistent. They have patterns. They have predictable responses to specific stimuli. And the person who has studied those patterns before the interaction begins holds a structural advantage that no amount of in-the-moment intelligence can fully compensate for. Machiavelli's spies were not just people in cloaks gathering secrets. They were observers. They were the diplomatic envoys who listened more than they spoke. They were the courtiers who paid attention to the silences in a room, to the dynamics between people, to the things that were conspicuously not said. They were, in the deepest sense, students of human behavior. And the intelligence they brought back was not just information about plans and positions, but about psychology, about character, about the invisible architecture of motivation that determined how people would act under pressure. You need to be your own spy. Every significant person in your professional and personal life, every competitor, every potential ally, every authority figure you must navigate, should be known to you as thoroughly as you can manage, not in a sinister way, not in a way that requires subterfuge, simply through the disciplined practice of observation, listening, and memory. Most people are far too busy broadcasting to do this. They are so focused on how they are being perceived, on what they should say next, on managing their own presentation, that they never develop any real intelligence about the people they're dealing with. They come to negotiations not knowing what the other person wants. They come to confrontations not knowing what the other person fears. They come to competitions not knowing what the other person's weaknesses are. They come blind, and then they're surprised when they lose. The second pillar, terrain. Every battle has a terrain. In military terms, it's the physical landscape, the hills, the rivers, the choke points, the ground that advantages one side over the other. In the wars of daily life, terrain is more complex, but no less real. It's the environment in which the conflict takes place, the social context, the political dynamics, the power structures, the invisible rules and hierarchies that shape who has leverage and who doesn't. Machiavelli was obsessed with terrain. He believed that the general who chose the battlefield had already won a significant portion of the war. Because by choosing the terrain, you choose the conditions. And by choosing the conditions, you determine which strengths will matter and which will not. This applies to you directly. Think about any high-stakes conversation you need to have. Where does it take place? When does it take place? Who else is present? All of these things are elements of terrain, and all of them are, to varying degrees, within your control if you are intentional about them. The person who must deliver difficult news, to a boss, to a team, to a partner, and delivers it in a rushed, public, high-pressure moment, has chosen terrible terrain. The same message delivered privately, at a moment of relative calm, with preparation and care, has a fundamentally different trajectory. The message is identical, the terrain is different, and terrain changes everything. Where do you tend to have your most important conversations? In the worst possible moments, when you're rushed, when emotions are high, when the environment is public, when the other person is distracted or threatened? If so, you are constantly choosing terrible terrain and then wondering why your important conversations go badly. Choose the terrain, choose the moment, choose the conditions. This is not manipulation, it is strategy. It is the recognition that context shapes outcome and that the person who controls context holds real power. Machiavelli would say, "Never fight uphill when you can maneuver to fight on level ground. Never fight in a space that disadvantages you when you can delay and reposition. Never accept the enemy's choice of battleground when you have the option to choose your own." In your world, this means never have the critical conversation in an email when it should be in person. Never raise a contentious issue in a group setting when it needs to be addressed one-on-one. Never begin a negotiation before you've done the groundwork that creates the conditions for agreement. Never enter a confrontation when your emotional state is compromised. Wait, prepare, regulate, and arrive composed. The third pillar, alliance. No war is won alone. Machiavelli understood this with brutal clarity. The isolated prince, the person who trusts no one, who builds no alliances, who operates in permanent solitude, is always vulnerable, no matter how strong they are individually. Because power, in the real world, is not just about individual capacity. It is about the capacity to command resources, loyalty, and action from others. But alliance building, in the Machiavellian framework, is not about popularity. It is not about being liked. It is about being useful, credible, and reliable, about creating webs of mutual interest that hold even under pressure. The strategic person builds alliances before they need them. This is the critical distinction. The reactive person reaches out for support when the crisis has already arrived, and finds that trust cannot be built in a moment of need. The strategic person has been cultivating relationships consistently, offering value before it's needed, building credibility through reliability, creating the conditions for support long before the moment of conflict arrives. Think about your own network. Are the people around you people who would act on your behalf in a difficult moment, not because you asked, but because the relationship is strong enough, the mutual interest clear enough, the trust deep enough? Or are your relationships transactional, surface level, the kind that look like alliances but would dissolve under any real pressure? Machiavelli watched princes lose everything in moments of crisis because they had mistaken attendance for loyalty, flattery for friendship, and proximity for alliance. The people who surrounded them in times of strength vanished the moment the wind changed, because those relationships had never been built on anything real. Real alliances are built on shared interest, mutual respect, and demonstrated reliability. They are built in the quiet times, not the loud ones. They are maintained through consistent, genuine investment, through the willingness to be valuable to others, not only when you need something from them, but as a consistent practice. The person who has built real alliances before the war starts arrives at conflict with a structural advantage that is nearly impossible to overcome from the outside. They are not alone. And not being alone changes everything. The fourth pillar: timing. Machiavelli's concept of fortuna, the force of circumstance, of opportunity, of the shifting tides of power, was not fatalistic. He did not believe that fortune was simply something that happened to you. He believed that fortune was a territory to be navigated, and that the single most important navigation skill was timing. Timing is the capacity to know when to move and when to wait, when to speak and when to be silent, when to advance and when to consolidate, when the conditions are right for action, and when forcing action against the conditions is simply accelerating your own defeat. This is one of the hardest disciplines because our culture has a pathological relationship with urgency. We have been trained to equate speed with strength, to interpret waiting as weakness, to treat delay as failure. And so we move too fast, too often, under conditions that are not yet right. And we sacrifice the outcomes we could have achieved with patience for the inferior outcomes we force through impatience. The master of timing knows that the most powerful move is often no move at all. The most effective response to provocation is often silence. The most strategic approach to opportunity is often to wait, not indefinitely, not passively, but to wait until the conditions align, until the terrain is right, until the alliances are in place, until the moment of maximum advantage. Machiavelli watched commanders destroy perfectly positioned forces by attacking a day too soon, a week too early, before the conditions were fully ripe. He watched brilliant strategies fail not because they were wrong, but because they were executed at the wrong moment. You have done this. You have had the right idea at the wrong time. You have pushed for something before the conditions were ready. You have spoken before the relationship was strong enough to hold the conversation. You have moved before your position was fully secured, and you have paid the price for it. Not because you lacked intelligence, but because you lacked patience. Patience is not passivity. In the Machiavellian framework, patience is active. It is the time you use to prepare more thoroughly, to gather more intelligence, to strengthen your position, to wait for the terrain to shift in your favor. It is, in the most literal sense, winning more of the war in the invisible phase so that less remains to be won in the visible one. The fifth pillar: adaptability. Even the most thorough preparation cannot anticipate everything. Machiavelli was clear about this. The world is too complex, too dynamic, too full of unexpected variables for any preparation to be complete. And so the fifth pillar, in some ways the most important, is the capacity to adapt without losing your position. This is the discipline of the prepared mind under the pressure of the unexpected. And it looks like this. When the unexpected arrives, when the negotiation takes an unforeseen turn, when the confrontation reveals information you didn't have, When the circumstances shift in ways that invalidate part of your preparation, the prepared person does not freeze, does not collapse, does not scramble in visible panic. They adapt, they recalibrate, they integrate the new information quickly, adjust their strategy, and continue to operate from a position of composure and control, even as they are, internally, revising their understanding of the terrain. This is the hardest pillar to develop, because it requires something that preparation alone cannot provide: experience under pressure. The capacity to adapt gracefully is built through having faced the unexpected enough times to trust your own ability to handle it. It is built through the practice of remaining composed when composure is difficult, through the training of the mind to process new information as data rather than as threat. But it is also built through preparation, because the more thoroughly you have prepared, the more deeply you understand the terrain, the more alliances you have, the more intelligence you hold, the less the unexpected can actually surprise you. Because you have already considered many of the ways things could go differently than planned. You have already thought through contingencies. You have already identified the variables most likely to shift. The prepared person's adaptation is not a desperate improvisation. It is a calculated pivot from one considered plan to another. Seamless, invisible, almost unconscious. The 5 pillars together: intelligence, terrain, alliance, timing, adaptability. These are not abstract concepts. They are daily practices. And when they become daily practices, they stop being effort and start being instinct. The person who has internalized these 5 disciplines does not consciously think, "I need to gather intelligence before a negotiation." They simply do it, automatically, because it has become part of how they engage with the world. They have become, in the most complete sense, a person who wins before the war starts. But here is where Machiavelli's doctrine takes a turn that most people don't expect. A turn that separates genuine strategic mastery from mere tactical cleverness. He understood that the 5 pillars, as powerful as they are, rest on a foundation that is even more fundamental. A foundation without which all the intelligence and terrain and timing in the world ultimately crumbles. That foundation is identity, not image, not reputation. Though those matter, identity. Who you actually are when no one is watching, when there's no battle on the horizon, when the pressure is off and the stakes are low. Because it is in those moments that the real work happens. The cultivation of the self that will show up when it matters. Machiavelli's ideal prince was not a costume that someone put on when dealing with power. It was a character that had been built, through discipline and self-examination and the accumulation of tested experience, into something genuine, something that couldn't be rattled because it had been tempered, something that couldn't be seduced because it knew its own value, something that couldn't be manipulated because it had no illusions about itself or the world it moved through. This person did not fight with hope. They fought with certainty. The certainty that comes not from arrogance, but from preparation so thorough that uncertainty itself had been minimized to the point of irrelevance. And they did not arrive at that certainty through a single dramatic transformation. They arrived at it through the accumulation of small, daily, invisible acts of preparation, the study done before it was needed, the alliance cultivated before it was necessary, the terrain mapped before the battle was announced, the weakness addressed before it could be exploited, the timing studied until it became second nature. They won their wars in the silence, in the margins, in the hours no one sees, in the discipline that looks, from the outside, like patience, but is actually the most aggressive form of action there is. Are you beginning to see it? The shift that's required is not in your tactics, it is in your relationship with time, with preparation, with the invisible phase of every conflict that most people completely ignore. Because right now, somewhere in your life, a war is already in progress. You may not have declared it. You may not even be fully aware of it yet. But the terrain is being shaped, the alliances are forming, the intelligence is being gathered by you or by someone else, or by the circumstances themselves. The question is whether you are in the invisible phase doing the work, or whether you are simply waiting for the visible moment to arrive and hoping you'll be ready. Machiavelli had no patience for hoping, and by the end of this video, neither will you. The coldest move is still coming. Stay with me, because what I'm about to show you in the next block is not just theory, it is practice. It is the specific, step-by-step architecture of how you take these 5 pillars and build them into the daily fabric of your life, until winning before the war starts is not an achievement you work toward, but a condition you inhabit. You're not ready for it yet, but you're closer than you were. Stay with me. Stop. Right here. Before we go further, I need you to do something most people will skip. I need you to think about a specific conflict, a specific battle, a specific war that is present in your life right now. Not hypothetically, not in the abstract, a real situation, a real tension, a real competition or confrontation or challenge that exists in your world today. Hold it in your mind, because everything that follows in this block is not theory for the future. It is instruction for now, for that specific situation you're holding. And by the end of this block, you will see it differently, not just intellectually differently, but strategically differently. You will have moved from the position of someone who is waiting for it to resolve to the position of someone who is already engineering that resolution. That is the shift. Let's get tactical. The first thing Machiavelli would do, the very first thing before any action, before any decision, before any communication, is conduct what I'll call the terrain assessment. A complete, honest, unsentimental mapping of the situation you're in. No narratives, no emotional framing, no self-serving interpretation, just facts, arranged with the precision of a general looking at a map. Here is how the terrain assessment works in practice. Ask yourself 5 questions. Write them down if you can, because the act of writing forces a clarity that mental notes never achieve. Question 1. What is actually at stake? Not what you feel is at stake, not the emotional significance you've attached to the situation, but what is objectively, materially at stake. What will actually change if this goes well versus if this goes badly? Be precise. Be cold. Strip away the ego and the feelings and look at the raw consequences. This matters because most people fight wars with enormous intensity for stakes that, when examined clearly, are much smaller than they feel. And that distorted sense of stakes is itself a vulnerability, because it makes you fight emotionally when you should be fighting strategically. Question 2. Who has power here and what is the nature of that power? Power is not monolithic. It comes in forms: formal authority, social influence, information advantage, emotional leverage, financial leverage, network position. Map every source of power in the situation. Where does your opponent have power? Where do you have power? Where are the power dynamics actually more in your favor than you've been assuming? And where are they less in your favor than you've been pretending? Question 3. What does your opponent actually want? Not what they say they want, not what you imagine they want. What are the underlying interests that are driving their behavior? Because in almost every conflict, the stated position, I want X, is not the real position. Beneath it is an interest, what they're actually trying to achieve, preserve, or avoid. The person who identifies the real interest is the person who can find solutions that the person focused on stated positions never sees. And those solutions are almost always the key to winning without fighting. Machiavelli was not a proponent of unnecessary warfare. This is the part of his philosophy that is almost universally misunderstood. He believed in force as a last resort, or rather, as a carefully chosen instrument deployed when it was genuinely the most effective option. But he consistently preferred the victory achieved without direct confrontation, because those victories were cleaner, cheaper, more complete, and less likely to generate the resentment that makes winning a war the beginning of a new one. Question 4. What are your own vulnerabilities in this situation? Be honest. Where are you exposed? What could be used against you? What is your emotional trigger in this specific context? What is the thing, if someone says it or does it, that would destabilize you? Because you can be certain that if your opponent is even moderately sophisticated, they have or will identify that trigger. And the only way to make it unusable is to know about it first and address it before the conflict reaches the moment where it might be deployed. Question 5. What would the outcome look like if I prepared perfectly? If you did everything right, gathered every piece of relevant intelligence, chose the ideal terrain, had all the right alliances in place, acted at the perfect moment, what would the outcome be? Describe it specifically. This is not wishful thinking. It is the target. The map needs to know where it's leading. Once you have completed the terrain assessment, you have something most people in your situation don't have: clarity. And clarity is power. The person who sees a situation clearly holds a structural advantage over everyone who is navigating it through the fog of emotion, assumption, and incomplete information. Now let's talk about the intelligence build. Most people, when preparing for a conflict, focus entirely on what they're going to say. They practice their arguments. They rehearse their positions. They prepare their justifications. This is fighting with your own weapons in isolation, without knowing anything about the weapons the other side has. The intelligence build is the practice of shifting your preparation focus from what you will say to what you will know. Before any significant interaction, gather everything you can about the other side. If it's a professional conflict, what is this person's history in situations like this? What outcomes have they achieved in the past? How do they behave under pressure? Do they escalate or do they become very still and quiet? What do they care about most? And what are they most afraid of losing? What is their reputation, and how much does their reputation matter to them? What leverage do they have, and what leverage do they lack? If it's a personal conflict, the same questions apply, filtered through a different context. What is this person's pattern in arguments? Do they get loud? Do they shut down? Do they deflect? Do they apologize strategically to de-escalate without actually changing anything? What is the currency that matters most to them in this relationship? Respect, security, appreciation, autonomy? What are their non-negotiable positions, and where are they actually flexible, even if they don't appear to be? This information is almost always available if you pay attention. People show you who they are consistently. They have tells, behavioral patterns they repeat under similar circumstances. They have values they can't help but telegraph. They have fears that shape their behavior in ways they don't fully control. The person who has studied these patterns before the interaction is not just one step ahead. They are operating in a fundamentally different dimension. They have access to the real conversation underneath the visible one. Here is a practical scenario. You are about to have a performance review conversation with a manager who has given you critical feedback. The reactive approach. You walk in nervous, defending yourself as the critique lands, getting emotional, saying things you haven't thought through, leaving the room with the relationship damaged and your position weakened. The Machiavellian approach. Before the conversation, you have gathered intelligence. You know this manager's history. They have a strong need for competence demonstration and a low tolerance for excuses. You know that when they give feedback, they are testing whether you receive it with strength or with fragility. You know that the best outcome in this conversation is not to defend yourself, but to demonstrate that you have already internalized the feedback and have a plan, because that is what triggers respect in this specific person. You have chosen the terrain. You've requested the meeting rather than waiting to be summoned. which puts you in the position of the person taking initiative rather than the person being evaluated. You have timed it correctly, not immediately after the incident that prompted the feedback, but after a short interval that suggests you've used the time to reflect. You walk in. They say the same things they were going to say regardless, but you respond differently, from a position of prepared strength rather than reactive defense. You acknowledge, you demonstrate insight, you present a plan, you invite their input in a way that makes them feel respected. The conversation ends with your position stronger, not weaker. Same feedback, different preparation, completely different outcome. That is the terrain assessment and intelligence build working in concert. Now let's talk about what Machiavelli would call the alliance architecture. Specifically, how to build the support structures that make you nearly impossible to defeat in any significant conflict. The mistake most people make with alliances is timing. They build them in moments of need. They reach out when they need something. They cultivate relationships when the conflict is already underway. Machiavelli would look at this with the contempt he reserved for all reactive behavior, because alliances built under pressure have a fundamental deficit. They are obviously transactional. The person being asked for help knows they're being asked because you're in trouble. And knowledge of your trouble is not a foundation for confidence in your strength. The alliance architecture is built before you need it. It is built in the ordinary, low-stakes moments of daily life. It is built through the consistent practice of being genuinely useful to others, not in an obvious, keeping score way, but in the quiet, sustainable way of someone who invests in relationships because they understand that networks of trust are among the most powerful strategic assets in existence. Here is the practice in concrete terms. Identify the 5 people whose support would be most valuable to you in the conflict you're currently navigating. Now ask yourself, not what can I get from them, but what can I offer them? What do they need that I can provide? Information, introduction, skill, perspective, presence, acknowledgement. Begin offering it now, without agenda, without expectation of immediate return. You are not manipulating them. You are building something real on the basis of genuine mutual value. The fact that it is also strategic does not make it insincere, because the best strategic relationships are genuine ones. Machiavelli understood that the prince who was loved as well as feared was in a position of maximum strength. And love, in this context, is not sentiment. It is the experience of being well served, respected, and consistently valuable in someone's life. Be that to the people who matter to your strategic position. Do it genuinely. Do it consistently. Do it before you need it. And now, the element that almost no one is willing to practice, the one that separates the people who win before the war starts from the people who believe they're preparing but are actually just performing preparation, the vulnerability audit. Machiavelli was relentlessly honest about this in his analysis of failed princes. The most consistent pattern he identified in people who lost power was not that they had weak alliances, or bad intelligence, or poor timing. It was that they had unexamined vulnerabilities, blind spots, ego defenses, emotional triggers, that their opponents found and exploited, often before the prince even realized what had happened. Your unexamined vulnerabilities are the most dangerous things in your strategic environment, not your opponents, not the circumstances, you, the parts of you that can be provoked, the insecurities that can be activated, the needs for approval, for validation, for control, for certainty, that when triggered, will override your strategy and put you in reactive mode at the worst possible moment. Conduct the vulnerability audit. Do it honestly, in private, with the willingness to be hard on yourself that most people reserve only for their enemies. Ask, what makes me reactive? What makes me defensive? What makes me emotional when I should be analytical? What do I need so badly that someone could use that need against me? And then, this is the part people skip, address it. Not by suppressing it, not by pretending it doesn't exist, but by working on it. By practicing the opposite of the reactive response in low-stakes situations until the new response becomes instinctive. By finding the people or practices that help you develop the composure and self-knowledge to operate from a place of genuine security rather than defended insecurity. This is internal preparation, and it is the foundation of everything else. Because all the intelligence in the world, all the perfect timing and ideal terrain and strong alliances, none of it protects you if, in the moment of maximum pressure, you become your own worst enemy. Now let me give you the dialogue frameworks, because Machiavelli understood that the way you speak in conflict is itself a strategic instrument. When faced with provocation, when someone says or does something designed to destabilize you, to provoke a reaction, to put you on the defensive, do not respond immediately. This is the hardest thing to practice and the most important. The instinct is to respond instantly, to defend, to counter, to show that you cannot be hit without hitting back. This instinct is the enemy of strategy. Instead, pause. A real pause. Not a dramatic one. A simple, calm, unhurried pause that says, I am not afraid of this moment. I am not threatened by this. I do not need to fill this silence with reassurance. Then, when you speak, use the language of questions rather than defenses. What is it specifically that leads you to that conclusion? Is more powerful than, that's not true. Because questions give you information. Because questions put the burden of explanation on the other person. Because questions are controlled, and control is power. When you need to establish position in a conflict, when you need to hold a line, decline a demand, assert a boundary, do not justify excessively. Justification is weakness in disguise. It signals that you are seeking permission for your position from the person challenging it. State your position once, clearly, without apology, and without elaboration beyond what is genuinely necessary. This is where I stand on this. Full stop. No nervous elaboration, no defensive justification, no preemptive apology. When you need to communicate from a position of strength, when you want to make clear, without aggression, without explicit threat, that you are someone who should not be underestimated or taken for granted, say less than you think is necessary. The instinct is to fill silences with information that reassures you as much as it informs them. Resist it. Let the silence work for you. Let your economy of expression communicate what elaborate explanation never can. That you are someone who does not need to explain yourself, who does not need to prove themselves, who already knows what they know, and is comfortable occupying that position without your validation of it. This is what Machiavelli meant when he talked about the prince who was neither too open nor too closed, who communicated strategically, revealing what served his position and withholding what did not, neither so opaque as to be unreadable, nor so transparent as to be exploitable. And then there are the errors, the Machiavellian taxonomy of strategic mistakes that cost people their positions, their wars, their power, not through dramatic failures, but through consistent, correctable errors that compound over time. The first error, revealing your full hand. In any conflict, in any competition, the person who shows everything they have too early has surrendered their greatest advantage. The opponent's uncertainty about what else you're holding keeps something in reserve, not deceptively, but strategically. Not everything needs to be deployed in the first exchange. The second error, fighting every battle. The person who responds to every challenge, who refuses to let any slight pass, who must win every argument and defend every position. This person is exhausting their resources in conflicts that don't matter, depleting their credibility, and making themselves predictable and ultimately beatable. Choose your battles with the deliberateness of someone who understands that not every battle deserves their full strength. Sometimes the most powerful response to a provocation is a quiet, composed non-response, which communicates more clearly than any counterattack that you are not threatened by this, that it is not worth your full attention, that you are occupied with things that matter more. The third error, underestimating the opponent. Machiavelli was merciless about this. The general who dismisses the enemy's capability, who walks into conflict assuming an easy victory, who does not take the time to study and respect the genuine strengths of the opposition, is not demonstrating confidence. He is demonstrating a dangerous form of arrogance that the prepared opponent will make him pay for. Respect your opponents, not with fear, but with the acknowledgement that they are capable of surprising you if you are not thoroughly prepared. Use that respect as fuel for more thorough preparation, not as anxiety, but as the disciplined recognition that complacency is the precursor to defeat. The fourth error, letting emotions lead the strategy. This is the most common error and the most devastating. The moment you allow your emotional state to dictate your strategic decisions, the moment you do something because you're angry or hurt or afraid or desperate, you have handed your opponent the most powerful weapon they could hope for: your own reactions. Emotions are information. They should be acknowledged, processed, and then set aside in the moment of decision. Your strategy should be built on clarity, not feeling. Your decisions should be made from your best self, not your most reactive self. The fifth error, waiting for perfection before acting. Machiavelli understood the paralysis of the person who waits for all conditions to be perfect before they move. Conditions are never perfect. The terrain is never ideal. The timing is never flawless. The alliances are never as strong as you'd like. The intelligence is never complete. At some point, the prepared person must act, must make the move that their preparation has made them ready for, even knowing that imperfection remains. The distinction is between the person who acts without preparation, recklessly, and the person who acts from preparation, knowing that no preparation is ever fully complete, but trusting that what they have built is sufficient. This is the transformation final. Because at this point in the video, something has shifted. You have been hearing these principles long enough that they are no longer just words. They are beginning to map themselves onto your actual life, onto the real battles you're fighting, the real vulnerabilities you have, the real preparation that remains undone. And that mapping is uncomfortable. It's supposed to be. The gap between who you've been strategically and who you could be, that gap, seen clearly, does not feel good. It feels like confronting a version of yourself you would prefer not to see. The version that has been losing wars it could have won. The version that has been reacting when it should have been planning. The version that has been arriving unprepared and paying the price. Look at that version squarely. Not with self-punishment, with Machiavellian clarity. It is simply a strategic position. It has costs, and it is about to change, because you are reaching the end of the doctrine, the part where it stops being philosophy and becomes identity, becomes character, becomes the person you are from this point forward. Stay with me. The final transformation is closer than you think. There is a before and an after. Every person who has genuinely internalized a transformative idea can identify the exact moment the shift happened. Not the moment they heard the idea, but the moment it moved from concept to conviction. The moment it stopped being something they knew and became something they were. If you've been paying real attention, if you've been holding the conflict I asked you to identify, running the terrain assessment, mapping your vulnerabilities, examining your patterns of preparation and reaction, then somewhere in the last hour, that shift may have begun. Maybe you felt it as recognition, that quiet, unsettling recognition of seeing yourself clearly and realizing that the person you've been strategically is not the person you are capable of being. Maybe you felt it as discomfort. The specific, pointed discomfort of understanding exactly where you've been losing and why. Maybe you felt it as something that doesn't have a clean name, something between determination and grief, between clarity and urgency. The feeling of a person who has just been handed a map of a territory they've been wandering in the dark. Whatever you felt, hold it. Because that feeling is the beginning of the identity shift. And the identity shift is the most important thing in this entire video. Not the tactics, not the frameworks, not the 5 pillars. Those are instruments. The identity shift is the player who holds them. Let me describe the person you are becoming. This person has changed their relationship with time. They no longer experience the future as something that happens to them. They experience it as something they are actively shaping right now in the invisible phase through the quality of their preparation. When they wake in the morning, they do not ask, "What will today bring?" They ask, "What have I done to be ready for what today will bring?" This is not anxiety, it is ownership. The ownership of a person who has accepted that they are responsible for their outcomes, not in the toxic, isolating sense of someone who denies the role of circumstance and chance, but in the empowering sense of someone who does everything in their power to maximize their position before they walk into any arena. This person has changed their relationship with conflict. They no longer dread it. They no longer approach it with the half-formed hope that it will somehow resolve itself before they have to fully engage with it. They approach it with the calm readiness of someone who has already done the work, who has assessed the terrain, gathered the intelligence, secured the alliances, identified the timing, and conducted the vulnerability audit. They walk into the visible conflict already holding conclusions they work toward in private. And that walk is different. Anyone watching can feel it. Not arrogance, not aggression, but the unmistakable quality of someone who knows exactly where they stand. This person has changed their relationship with themselves. They are no longer at war with their own weaknesses. They see them clearly, with the cold, respectful attention of a general examining the vulnerability in his own formation, and they work on them steadily, systematically, without drama. They understand that self-knowledge is the foundation of every other strategic capacity, and they invest in it as consistently as they invest in any external preparation. This person does not need to be the loudest in the room. They have learned what Machiavelli knew, that the person who speaks least often is often the one who has thought most, and that the quality of your preparation is announced not by what you say, but by how you move, how you respond, how you hold yourself under pressure, how you handle the unexpected. This person has become, in the deepest sense, unrattleable. Not because nothing touches them. Life touches everyone. Pain is real, setbacks are real, loss is real. Unrattleable does not mean unfeeling. It means that the emotional experience of difficulty no longer overrides the strategic capacity to respond to it. It means that you can be hit, really hit, and absorb the impact without losing your position, without scrambling, without revealing your vulnerabilities in the moment of their exploitation, without becoming reactive in the moment that demands composure. This is the armor Machiavelli was describing, not the armor of the wall that keeps everything out, that isolates and protects at the cost of connection and engagement. The armor of the tested warrior, the kind that has been through fire, that knows its own strength, that can absorb impact and still function. You are building this armor. You have been building it throughout this video, perhaps without fully knowing it. Every time you engaged honestly with the questions posed here, every time you held your real situation against the frameworks offered, every time you sat with the discomfort of seeing yourself clearly, you were adding a layer. Keep adding layers. Now let's consolidate. Because the doctrine is extensive, and before you leave, it needs to be distilled into the most essential truths, the ones you will carry with you, that will shape your preparation tomorrow morning when this video is long over. The first truth. The invisible phase is where real power is built. Every significant conflict in your life has a visible phase and an invisible phase. The visible phase is what people see: the confrontation, the competition, the negotiation, the performance. The invisible phase is everything that happened before: the preparation, the intelligence, the positioning, the self-work. Most people put almost all their energy into the visible phase and almost none into the invisible. This is the fundamental strategic error of the unprepared. Reverse the ratio. Put your most serious energy into the phase no one sees. Arrive at the visible moment already holding the advantage you built in private. The second truth. Your most dangerous opponent is always the reactive version of yourself. External opponents have limited power to defeat you if your internal strategic architecture is sound. The person who provokes you most effectively, who exploits your vulnerabilities most completely, who consistently keeps you from your best strategic performance, is almost always some version of yourself. The reactive, emotional, ego-driven, unexamined version. Know that version. Study it with the same cold precision you would study an external opponent. Address its weaknesses with the same seriousness you would address any external threat. Because until you have neutralized the enemy within, no amount of external preparation is sufficient. The third truth. Preparation is not an event. It is a posture. The person who prepares when necessary is always behind. Because wars announce themselves only after they have already begun. The terrain is always being shaped. The alliances are always forming. The intelligence landscape is always shifting, whether or not you are engaged with it. The strategic life is a life of continuous, low-intensity preparation. The ongoing habit of mapping your environment, studying the people in it, strengthening your vulnerabilities, building your alliances, refining your timing, not as an anxious response to threat, but as the natural posture of someone who has chosen to live in the invisible phase permanently. The fourth truth. Knowing is not enough. This is perhaps the most important truth in this entire video, and the one most easily forgotten. You may have heard some version of everything in this video before. You may have understood these principles at some level for years, and yet you keep losing wars you could have won. Not because you lack knowledge. Because knowledge, without the discipline to practice it consistently, is just the awareness of your own limitations. The practice is everything. The daily repetition of the intelligence discipline, the terrain discipline, the alliance discipline, the timing discipline, the vulnerability discipline. The daily commitment to showing up as the prepared person, not the reactive one. The daily choice in each interaction that matters, to operate from strategy rather than impulse. That choice, made consistently over time, does not just change your outcomes. It changes you. It builds into you an entirely different relationship with the world, one in which conflict is not something that happens to you, but something you shape and largely determine before it becomes visible. And now, the paradox that Machiavelli lived with his entire life, the paradox that sits at the heart of this entire doctrine, the truth that the most prepared people understand and the least prepared people never do. The person who prepares most thoroughly is also the person least likely to need to fight. This is not a contradiction. It is the deepest strategic insight of the doctrine. Because the people around you, your opponents, your competitors, your rivals, are always, consciously or unconsciously, assessing you. They are reading your posture. They are sensing your preparation. They are measuring against whatever they know about you, whether engaging with you is worth the cost. The person who arrives at every arena with the quiet, undeniable presence of someone thoroughly prepared, who has done the work, who knows the terrain, who has the alliances, who has addressed the vulnerabilities. This person sends a signal that the calculated opponent reads clearly. The cost of fighting this person is high. The probability of winning is low. The risk is not worth taking, and so they don't take it. Not out of cowardice, out of calculation. Which is exactly what you have been doing throughout this video, applying calculation to a domain most people navigate emotionally. Machiavelli watched this phenomenon play out in court after court, in city after city. The prince who was most prepared had, paradoxically, the fewest wars to fight, because the preparation itself was a deterrent. The walls did not get attacked because the walls were clearly unbreachable. The position did not get challenged because the position was clearly secured. The person did not get underestimated because the person had never given anyone reason to underestimate them. This is the ultimate expression of the doctrine, not to fight and win, but to be so thoroughly prepared to fight that you rarely need to. The sword that is never drawn is the one that has never been tested, and that may or may not be sharp. But the sword that everyone knows is sharp, that has been seen drawn and returned, that is carried with the quiet certainty of someone who knows its capability. That sword does not need to be drawn. Its presence alone reshapes the room. Be that sword, not through aggression, not through posturing, through preparation so thorough and consistent that it becomes visible in your presence, in your composure, in the way you move through conflict and complexity with a calm that others cannot help but notice and respect. This is the transformation. Not a dramatic moment, a slow, steady, cumulative building of the person who wins before the war starts, who earns that quality through discipline, through self-knowledge, through the daily practice of the invisible phase, until it is no longer an achievement, but a character. Not what you do, but what you are. And you are already becoming it. The fact that you are here, that you stayed through this entire video, that you engaged with the uncomfortable questions, that you held your real life against these frameworks, that is not nothing. That is evidence of the very quality this doctrine requires. The willingness to do the invisible work, to invest in the phase no one sees, to show up for the preparation that others skip. You are already different from who you were an hour ago. Not dramatically, not visibly, but structurally. The architecture has shifted, and architecture, once shifted, changes what can be built. Build well. Go now and conduct your terrain assessment. Tonight, before you sleep. For the real conflict you've been holding throughout this video. Answer the 5 questions. Write them down. Look at the terrain with cold clarity. Map the intelligence you need to gather, and decide how you will gather it. Identify your vulnerabilities, and decide which one you will address first. Map the alliances you need to build, and identify the first genuine act of value you can offer tomorrow. Do not wait for the war to announce itself. The war has already started. It started the moment you realized you weren't prepared for it. But that war, unlike the ones you've lost before, is already beginning to shift in your favor. Because this time, you are in the invisible phase. This time, you are doing the work. And Machiavelli, who understood power with a clarity that 5 centuries have not dulled, would look at you, engaged in this preparation, doing this invisible work, and he would nod with that cold, precise, unsentimental approval that is more valuable than any hollow praise. He would say, "Now you understand. Now the war is already yours." If this message reached something real in you, if somewhere in this hour a truth landed that you cannot unknow, then leave a comment below with the words, "I win in the silence." This is not a comment. It is a declaration. A commitment to the invisible phase. A statement that you have chosen, from this moment, to be the person who does the work that others skip, who builds the preparation that others neglect, who shows up to every battle already holding the advantage earned in private. It is a pacto silencioso, a silent pact between everyone watching this video who has made the same choice. Welcome to the fortress. And if you want to continue building inside it, if you want more of this doctrine, more of this precision, more of the tools that separate the prepared from the reactive, then subscribe, not as a passive act, as a deliberate commitment to the discipline of preparation. Because every video on this channel is built on the same principle. The work you do before the world sees you is the work that determines everything the world sees. Go now. Let the silence be your strategy. Let the preparation be your armor. Let the invisible work be your weapon. And may the war always be won long before anyone knows it's begun.